Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is John, and this is the session Adhering to and Preparing for Changing Clinical Requirements Around the Globe. It's day 2 of the Global MedTech Regulatory Trends True Quality Summit series. And if you missed any sessions yesterday, you can watch the recordings on demand. But we're excited to have you join us for this discussion on changing clinical requirements around the globe. This session will run for around an hour. And if any questions come up throughout the presentation, just please ask in the chat or use the question functionality on the right-hand side of your screen to get as many questions as possible. We'll try to get to them after the discussion as well. But let's get started with some introductions from everyone. Matt and Alethea, welcome. I'd like to turn my hat to you, Alethea, first. Just to give us a brief introduction to yourself and tell us a little bit about how you got into the MedTech industry.
Yeah, it's great to be with everyone today. Thank you so much. My name's Alethea Wieland. I'm the president and founder of Clinical Research Strategies. We're a boutique CRO and executive management consultancy in the life sciences space. I was attracted to the MedTech industry, medical device industry, having worked first in drug development and clinical operations in the drug space, and really wanted to diversify my background. And boy, did I find the right niche for me. We really love devices.
So you really love devices. What is it specifically you love about devices versus anything else that you did in the past?
I see an acceleration of the technology that is more in line with how you can incorporate software, for instance, in the development of these types of technologies. And it really does leverage that whole technology growth area more than the drug space does, even though there's big data in the drug development world. And Matt might be able to attest to, from the safety perspective, safety in the drug world is significantly much more to cover and than the MedTech and the device world. So it just is more of a natural fit for me.
Gotcha. I can relate to that. That's also part of the reasons why I got into the industry. The software side of it actually interested me quite a lot. So I can totally relate to that. Thank you, Alethea. Well, turning my head towards you, Matt. I know that you cannot see that I'm turning towards you because you're on the left side of my screen. But tell me a little bit about yourself, Matt. And by the way, also, if you could tell me a little bit about what is motivating you right now in your professional life.
Yeah, thanks, John. I'm happy to be here. So I'm Matt Wagner. I'm our VP of CRO Services here at Proxima Clinical Research. So we're a CRO in the space, providing regulatory consulting and clinical trial execution services to emerging companies and new technologies. So have a background in the space in mostly clinical operations overall in my career, but really, I guess what's motivating me these days, I think, is the innovation that we get to see. I mean, we're essentially a company focused on early stage companies, bringing new technologies to market. And in the MedTech space, I mean, it's so rapidly changing, especially, as you guys said, with the software components that you see. It makes innovation just never ending, really, I guess is kind of how you see it. As fast as you can spin out software these days, people are getting more creative with the solutions that they're coming up with. So, I mean, it's super exciting to be a part of that. Every day when you go to work, there's something new project to tackle, a new product. Solving a new issue out in the healthcare space. It's so diverse. I mean, it's diverse in challenges, diverse in opportunities. So, I mean, that's really what drives me each day, is trying to be a part of that and how we can help bring something new to market and bring it as fast as we can.
Sounds to me like you might have some sort of an entrepreneurial spirit to yourself as well.
Like a logo on it, which wasn't a thing yesterday.
You're on right now. Let me see if I can see that. Or that's just like a
sorry. I'm gonna mute. Yeah, sorry for that. Well, thank you, Matt. Thank you, Alethea. Thanks for your introductions. So I'm gonna try to keep this a little bit loose today because the topic of our panel here is very broad. And we had a conversation about the panel a week ago about the different topics we wanted to address. And it sounds to me like we're going to be tackling software as a medical device a bit as well. We'll get to that later, but just to lay out the basics of what we're going to be addressing here today, clinical requirements, clinical evidence, globally, locally. Can you give us an idea of what clinical requirements are and when clinical evidence is relevant in the regulatory sense for medical devices? Maybe we'll start with you, Alethea.
Yeah, there's, with the recent passage of the EU MDR and more regulatory refinement from the 21st Century Cures Act in the US with the FDA, rolling out new guidance documents, rolling out new pathways to be able to leverage US market first. We're really seeing, a shift in gears. Basically, the pendulum has swung, where many companies would start with a CE marking first in Europe. That was usually the easiest way to get on the market. And now the pendulum has swung back to the United States. So the FDA has seen many companies actually lose income, lose revenue, and send it to Europe first. And so they, with the passage of the 21st Century Cures Act, that has certainly enabled these tech companies, medical device companies, diagnostics, software as a medical device, to really hone in on that US pathway first. So, clinical evidence generation is a life cycle, isn't it? It's from, the proof of concept or early feasibility studies that really help you with a publications program. From the EU MDR perspective, you've got to really, talk to the notified body, have a basic understanding of the risk category. Risk management, risk categorization is super important as you talk to the regulators. And, notified bodies and their medical experts certainly look at things a little bit differently, especially from a post-market surveillance or post-market follow-up of your clinical studies for that continuum of clinical evidence. So literature reviews, the detailedness of those literature reviews, whether you're trying to incorporate your competitors' technology to help sing the praises of the safety and efficacy, can certainly go a long way, which is not the usual way to do it with the US FDA. And that's what's so unique about Europe, is capitalizing on the risk categorization of the devices, including your competitors, to really show current state of the art. Those concepts are not really used in the US so much.
Yeah.
So those would be the things that I kind of see as those different perspectives.
Okay.
But I think the bottom line is really making sure over the course of your product roadmap, your product development, there's really feasibility, getting those publications out there, building out that compendium of evidence for your website, et cetera. You really want to deploy as many things as you possibly can. Investigator-initiated studies, these smaller studies that maybe tease out market access questions and return on the investment.
You mentioned a couple of different varieties of activities or clinical activities that could be applicable for medical devices. And you also mentioned that there's a difference between how they're perceived between Europe, for example, and the FDA. But Matt, thinking about that, if we take it one step back, when is it relevant for medical device companies to start think about clinical evidence and clinical requirements? If we think about the life cycle of a medical device, what is your opinion on that? When should companies start thinking about clinical evidence in general about their devices?
Yeah, it's a good question, John. I think, as Alethea said, I mean, you really first have to know your classification of your device. I think that's kind of the first step. Really understanding what class you are, whether you're going in the US market, understanding how the classifications work in the US, or you're going to EU market, whether you're planning to go to both, understanding the class, and then starting to understand the pathway. That's going to tell you what level of clinical evidence you're ultimately going to need for your product. So John, you're really going to thinking about clinical evidence from day one. but really trying to figure out how much and what's required, what those requirements are, is going to be determined by your product, by your specific classification. You know, are you a non-significant risk device in the U.S.? Are you significant risk? You know, what's your pathway that you're going to be undertaking, and then evaluating again, what are the predicates out there, what are other similar devices doing, and starting to build that clinical evidence up is really the key. But you're going to have to be thinking about it from day one. Essentially, what are you going to need to start building your case, to start building that total package of clinical evidence, whether it's the literature review that's going to go with it from other products or similar products, or whether it's actually running a clinical investigation as well.
Yeah. I mean, I think you're right in the fact that you need to start thinking about this from the get-go, because you've probably seen this just as much as I have, both of you, that, you know, startups that are just starting out and they're raising funds tend to say, we can reduce by X, we can save lives. But in reality, they do not have any hardcore clinical evidence behind it. And if you look at it from the legal side of things, this is illegal. It is illegal to state something that you cannot demonstrate in terms of clinical effectiveness. So if you want to do that, you need to start thinking about how you achieve that from the get-go. So that's a very good point. But when you think about a medical device technical file and all the requirements that are required for a QMS system that it's built up around a medical device, the production, the manufacturing, the designs, and technical file is one thing. How does the clinical data fit in with the technical file?
Yeah, it's just one piece, right, of that. I mean, obviously, as you said, John, there's so many pieces of that technical file. You got to have all of your device descriptions, your labeling, all of your detailed QMS requirements, everything that's, you know, in compliance with ISO, you know, 14971. So everything else that's going into that technical file is all very important information, and your clinical evidence, your clinical requirements, that's going to obviously be another big component of it. That's often, sometimes the companies that we work with, they'll have expertise within their in-house team. You know, they have a product team that's really an engineering team. They're doing great things, innovating their product and building out their product. And then with that comes building the quality system that goes to support their product. And then really trying to find how they're going to help develop then the clinical evidence to go along with that. Do they have expertise in the design? Do they need to, you know, get feedback from clinicians out in the real world and start building up that clinical package that's also going to go and support their product? It's a component of that whole technical file. It's just another large component of what's going to be needed to get their product to market.
Do you also call it clinical package, Alethea?
Yes, and you know, to complement what Matt is suggesting is, you know, let's face it, as you're building the plane, so to speak, or building the technology, there's three primary groups within a MedTech or medical device company that really need to be in lock and step, and those are the clinical piece, the regulatory piece, and quality assurance. I've worked with clients and companies, and I've been parts of sponsors where if you have discordance or if you have quality that's not quite up to where the regulatory submission package is, you're going to find out about it, and it's going to impact your clinical evidence generation. And so I think one of the takeaways that we could bring up in today's panel session is assuring that as you're growing your company or raising funds, that those three pathways are in sync with each other. I've been a part of clinical trials where the device locking or the design history file is still sort of in disruption. And, you know, what ends up happening is if you don't think about locking the device design, the regulators absolutely, if they look at the quality documentation and where software is, and you're still making changes during a clinical trial, that's a major no-no. And so
that's a good point.
That's a very notified bodies are going to detect that. Yeah,
that is a very good point, because that is one of the reasons why clinical should be considered a part of the whole package that you're creating, because all the things that you describe in your technical side of things, when we say technical, we're really just talking about the specifications and everything related to the QMS part of creating your product. If anything changes there, that can impact your clinical package. your clinical
That's
side of
right.
things.
And the notified body
Totally.
or the US FDA or any other regulatory body will detect it. Though they need to see, did your software change during the course of the clinical trial? If so, can you articulate that it was non-substantive, that it was maybe a simple fix or whatever the case is, but that design history file, you've got to make sure that is a primary driver to the quality of the evidence that you're generating in your clinical evidence program. Now, that's not to say that you can't make changes at frequencies that make sense, maybe between an early feasibility study that's complete before you launch a large randomized controlled trial. By all means, that's expected. You can't have your technology stuck in time and you've got to always be improving it and augmenting it. So, just making sure that everyone participating in today's session has an appreciation for those three intertwined departments, making sure they're communicating over time, especially from a risk management perspective. That risk management file is in a constant state of continuous quality improvement and revision. And, you just have to be aware of the releases of the technology.
Yeah, totally right. So when we think about releases of technology, that is very different from whether it's a software as a medical device, a traditional medical device, or a high-risk device. There are procedures that you need to take to release a device to be able to be used in a clinical study, for example. But okay, let's take a little bit look at the differences between the regulatory frameworks around the world. And I said around the world, but really when you look at it, the US market is 40% roughly of the total MedTech market in the world, and Europe is around 30%. So combined, Europe and the US, they make up around 70% of the total MedTech market. So with that in mind, we might keep a little bit more focus on those two areas. But when we think about the US, FDA, Canada, and so forth, the Americas and EU, in terms of differences when it comes to clinical evidence and clinical requirements, could you maybe speak a little bit on that, Alethea or Matt?
I'll let Matt go.
Sure. I think really the key thing that kind of stands out to me, and I guess maybe this is kind of a U.S. requirements that pop a little bit. I mean, the FDA generally is going to require a U.S. population, of some sort, or you have to have an extremely clear demonstration of how an outside the U.S. Study is going to represent that U.S. population. So the U.S. still is going to hold fast to that. Doesn't mean you can't run a global study. So, I mean, just to make that clear, but as far as like a key difference, you would really want to consider what your strategy is going to be if you're going into the US market and other markets, but you could run essentially a study in multiple markets. But again, you're really going to have an early conversation with the FDA about that population. So I think that's really one that just kind of sticks out to me right away is the population difference. There's also some nuance differences in the states, under obviously if you have a significant risk versus non-significant risk classification and how that's handled in the United States. Essentially needing if you're a high risk, significant risk product, you're going to need to file what's called an IDE application versus non-significant risk. You can get approval on your ethics committee IRBs to start your study. So that's a difference here in the States. So those are kind of the two things that just kind of pop out to me right away as kind of key differences and making sure you understand when you're running a clinical study between the two different markets, what you really need to know. A lot of clients will ask, how do I get to know some of that I don't know? Well, clearly we always say engage early with the agencies that you're going to be working with and get some feedback in like a pre-submission meeting. So I'll let Alethea expand on that, but that's kind of what pops to me first.
Yeah, I love that discussion, Matt. The thing that I like to remind folks about is the ISO standard 14155. Now, those of us who've been in the industry, I've been in for about 35 years. The last version was from 2000, and then it took about eight to 9 years to get it to be released in 2020. And I know in Europe that they're spearheading the next version, basically the third version, because the second version that was released in 2020 really didn't adequately describe sort of these nuanced clinical trials that are now required, the post-market activities, post-market surveillance, these follow-up studies, maybe even investigator-initiated trials. The ISO 14155 is still limited, and especially even including for software as a medical device, or the nuanced use of in silico clinical trials, for instance, where you're simulating data rather than utilizing it in patients first. So I very much look forward to keeping in touch and keeping that at the forefront. I think everyone participating today should, another takeaway is to follow what ends up happening with V3, which I would anticipate being released probably in about a 2 or 3 year time frame. And I look forward to seeing how that changes.
Yeah, I think it's important to mention that the ISO 14155 was also recently recognized by FDA as a consensus standard. So what that basically means is that they require that clinical studies that are conducted in relation to submissions for the FDA should follow that standard and applicable sections of the ICH GCP requirements as well. And it's interesting that you mentioned that there's talks about this standard being already updated right now because of lack of support for modern clinical activities. If you look at the type of clinical activities that companies are and can initiate in the MedTech industry, and you spoke a little bit about that, Alethea, in the beginning, are there differences in the types of activities we're initiating, whether we're focusing on FDA route or EU?
Yeah, I think it's a super important question, and that's why that guidance is already out of date. The way that we're expanding, especially in software as a medical device, the utilization of artificial intelligence and machine learning, these things are not articulated in that guidance document or ISO standard. So, and this is where the stakeholder conversation with the notified body and or the regulators, US FDA, Health Canada, Australia TGA, et cetera, is really important, because the moment you start a clinical trial program, you want some assurance that by the time that you're done with it in 2 or 3 years' time, that the data will be relevant. That now it's true, you have to prove out safety and efficacy in that clinical trial. You may actually fail, and you may have to pull that product from the market, so to speak. But we're really seeing where this is maverick time. This is like the Wild West, to use a term in the United States. This is the Wild West of MedTech. And Matt, I'd love to hear what you have to say about that perspective.
Yeah, no, this is such a good conversation. I mean, when you look at like ISO and FDA, John, and mentioning that, I mean, it's absolutely true. I think we see the FDA adopting that, but you still see the FDA, layering on. They're probably going to have some additional requirements still. So as much as globally we'd want, the ISO guideline to just be accepted completely globally and be able to say that it's exactly the same in both markets or in multiple markets, it's getting closer, with the FDA accepting the guidelines, but there's still always going to be nuances in the market that, the FDA is probably going to always have something nuanced, right? They're never going to let it be exactly the same between US and Europe and other markets. Yeah, the Wild West, I agree with that comment too. I mean, it's with the software, I think that's how we feel. It's so rapidly changing, and the guidelines are struggling to keep up. And no harm, no foul. I don't think there's anything other than it's just the speed. I think it's the speed of innovation, which is driving that, which is great. I mean, the speed of innovation is driving change with our agencies, with our regulatory bodies, with new standards being, refreshed and already being considered being refreshed, even though it hasn't been too long, from a last release. So I think that innovation is driving that type of thought, continuous improvement, not just with your product, but also with our approval pathways and how we're getting there. And that software change, that as rapid as it is, I think is really driving that, which is really great to see. Because with software changes, I mean, software as a medical device is still a device. And so when you have a design freeze, but yet you can easily tweak your software and now it's a new product, and that's innovation that can happen so rapidly The review cycles can't keep up. And so that's just kind of a constant push against that wall and innovation. So that's a natural struggle I see that we're dealing with the agencies.
So natural struggle that you're dealing with the agencies. Okay, so I heard both of you speak about the differences between the FDA putting well, differences in terms of what requirements are put forth by the FDA versus, for example, in Europe. There are also minor differences globally, for example, in Asia or Oceania, small differences that the local authorities believe are relevant. But why is it that there's no consensus in terms of what clinical evidence is deemed to be sufficient for medical devices? Why do the different countries and continents need to have different opinions on how clinical evidence is perceived for a medical device? Is that due to historical reasons? Is that due to society related reasons? Or what do you think? Well, why should FDA think that the way that you conduct studies in the FDA should be done like this, but the way that you conduct studies in the EU should be done like this, which might result different results? Why is there no consensus in terms of clinical data just needs to be done like, collected like that?
Yeah, I might like to take this first, and then I'm excited to hear what Matt would say on top of this. But, in the United States, everyone knows we have huge lobbies in AdvaMed, for instance, that really help influence policy. And so, and a lot of the large medical device companies or midsize or even the innovative groups fund AdvaMed to go to bat about making things a little bit easier. So I bet most of the people on today's call are familiar with the 510K pathway, for instance. The 510K pathway was a really easy kind of show me that you're substantially equivalent to an existing technology on the market. And in the more recently, the FDA was really bashed about the ease of which med device companies were able to get substantially equivalent claims, despite the fact that they might not need the clinical evidence to show that they were substantially equivalent, just by sheer fact of stating technological specification equivalence. They had the possibility of getting cleared with a 510K. So the scrutiny level on the ease of which companies could get into this type of regulatory clearance has, on the flip side, the FDA has come in a little bit tighter on the 510K pathway. So more recently, they said, hey, listen, if you're making a comparison to a technology that's been on the market that's over 20 years old, no, you've got to show a different sort of state of the art, that you're more technically compared to something that is more recent, for instance. So that I've noticed is very different. The concept of state of the art is a function of Europe. I know that lobbies, there's some different lobby groups in Europe, but I've just seen a little bit more of a conservative approach with the implementation of EU MDR. I think a lot of this stood up on the that PIP breast implant scandal that happened well over 10 years ago. A correctiveness, basically, of the manufacturing and quality process. And then, of course, these class action lawsuits especially in the orthopedic space. I think, we're seeing a response policy-wise, regulatory-wise of these additional crises that have happened in the industry, and making sure, let's face it, the regulatory bodies, they have to keep patient safety first. That's number one. So I'd love to hear what you have to say, Matt, on that particular topic.
Yeah, no, I think this is a good topic to continue to explore, I think, between the different agencies and bodies. And I think the way that it can continue to bubble up would probably be, again, more products coming into multiple discussions with different notifying bodies or agencies at the same time. Because it is a valid question that we talk about with some of our clients on a regular basis. What's really the difference in that patient population? What's the difference in the data set that they have obtained in their home country, where they've been developing their product, versus the data set that now the agency is asking them to provide in another country? And why really do they need to duplicate that data, or why do they need to get additional data? And so I think that patient population is really the key. Where I've seen, again, pushback, I think in the discussions is really trying to justify your patient population. So often, I think I've seen this kind of maybe on the drug side where they talk about patient populations all the time too, when you're running a global drug study, and what kinds of differences. And sometimes they just don't know. The feedback from the agencies, they just don't know. So they want a diverse population. And that's really just where they stand. They say clinically, we want a diverse population. And so I think sometimes that's where the bodies kind of sit, as they say from a scientific, medical, clinical standpoint, they don't understand or know what those differences might be on your product in this use case with a different population. And so they want to diversify the population. And maybe that's also another just kind of big buzzword in the industry. When are you getting real world? Are you diversifying your population? Is it truly representative? And so they want that kind of data set. That's probably the biggest feedback I could give someone of why, the rationale. But if you can paint the case for your particular product, I encourage clients to continue to paint that case. Explain why this population set is just as equivalent as any other population set. I'm really trying to paint that picture, because obviously that will lower your burden of clinical evidence, for one, if you already have it in your country. But it'll help justify, again, maybe your sample size justification as well, and what kind of diversity, because some indications are more easier to accrue in different locations. And so that also may help with your burden of gathering that level of evidence in a certain country. So I think it is a good discussion, but keep kind of bubbling up that population difference is really, I think, what's key in my mind for that clinical data set.
But it's not like Europe in its sense is less like different or there's less variety in terms of the population. Is it because the types of studies and the types of the countries where you typically do run your studies in Europe that might be influencing that? For example, that FDA just doesn't accept that you conduct studies solely in Germany, UK, because the populations there are not as, there's not as big of a variety as it is in general in the US.
Yeah, I might like to take this one. So we need every single study subject we can possibly get. So the regulators are not going to put in obstacles to get those patients in the trials. Everyone knows that basically if 100 patients come into a clinic who are eligible, who meet inclusion, exclusion criteria, it's only about 5% actually agree to participate in research. So we need every single patient we can possibly get. The nice to haves are what Matt is talking about, the inclusion exclusion criteria to assure that we do have a diversified population. Here in the United States, we always try to get challenge patients from a different socioeconomic background, because it's well known in the field, it's been published hundreds of times, that the traditional clinical trial subject is a white male. And so we need to get more women. We need to get more diversification in terms of demographics, and to really show that these subgroup populations are adequately tested from a safety and efficacy perspective. Because from a market clearance or market approval perspective, it's really for the bigger population. So I think with the technologies of wearables and the telemedicine and things that are happening from an automated perspective, I know probably some of the audience has great software that's picking up data and it's streaming. There's real opportunities for regulators to appreciate and not set up roadblocks to getting patients in these trials. So it's basically making sure that you're identifying the right key opinion leaders, subject matter experts, principal investigators to participate for the quality of the evidence. I've been a part of clinical trials, and I bet Matt has too, where if you pick someone who is less experienced, sometimes that quality in the data, or you can't get the research coordinators to do the inputs, really will drag your study down. So it's you know, you kind of got to balance out the nice to haves and making sure that you're making great attempts to get diversified patient populations in, but at the same time not risk getting your clinical trial study done, you know, to then do your technical file or your dossier submission or your 510K submission or your de novo or whatever. Matt, what do you have to, I bet you have some interesting things to add to that.
Oh, I smile a little bit when you talk about the balance of the investigators. It's so true. Obviously, the agency wants a diverse population. You've got to kind of do what they're requiring you to do. And you really need to find those patients where they are, right? That's such a constant struggle. As you said, again, the number of patients, everyone walks in and says, well, I know Dr. So-and-so who sees, 50 of these patients a day. And then you start to dig a little deeper. Well, does Dr. So-and-so actually do research in his practice? Has he ever done research in his practice? Does he understand the quality requirements that go into it? That physician, the investigator, needs to be aware of. It's so true, because you're looking for those patients, but you've got to balance it with what are your must-haves and what are your nice-to-haves, as you just said. We've really seen a lot of companies struggle the past year with that. I think obviously with the pandemic, it changed a lot of environment of how patients flowed. It changed a lot of environment with clinics, with staffing shortages. It changed a lot of other dynamics that we weren't having to deal with as much as just finding the quality investigators and then finding the patient throughput. Now we're dealing with other struggles that are ancillary to that still, with just, do they have the staff? And so when you're trying to balance that, you got to also remember balance that with quality. Because if you open up a site where they're seeing 100 of those patients, but they're not collecting the data in the right way, that's going to end up being a potential risk for you more than the speed to market. You may have to not use that site, not use that data if it wasn't collected correctly. So you have a lot of risk in there, and you got to balance it.
And what do you mean specifically if a site does not collect data correctly? Could you give us an example?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on what type of data and what type of study you're running. But examples of one of the simplest studies I could think of that we ran recently is a diagnostic study. A single visit, a single day, you're collecting one sample as standard of care, and you're collecting one sample to run on a diagnostic in that clinic. Very simple, very straightforward. But the site did have a high throughput and did not have experience with research. And so missing steps, such as just following your instructions for use to the T, right? You have to follow it to the T, and you would need to collect that data of every single time point that's being done on your instructions for use to make sure that the sites are actually following those instructions to that level of detail. Did they look at, this was a lateral flow device, so it actually looking at it within a 15-minute window, right? They take a sample, they run the sample. There's very specific minutes that they need to track and make sure it's done. If the site wasn't super experienced in research, they weren't used to the demands that puts on you, and letting them know, like, obviously, a minute matters in your study. You want to make sure they're following that instruction for use to a T. So that's just an example, John, of some potential risks. Again, if they don't have experience, if they don't have staff that have the time to actually dedicate to, collect that data. It's very simple, very small amount of data, but high risk if they don't know what they're doing.
Well, having observed these type of studies over the course of the last 10 years supporting MedTech companies with clinical data collection, it's become more and more known to me that MedTech manufacturers truly believe that clinical sites and clinical staff are the solution to their problems, but often that's usually where the problems start, because there are so many factors involved in conducting clinical data collection, whether it's a study or a survey, whatever it might be, that can be impacted by the people that are involved. And I guess when it comes down to it, this is really, really what distinguishes MedTech clinical operations from pharmaceuticals. Because you have a device, you have a manual that you need to follow. There are workflows that can impact the ways that you use the device. when you take that into account, that is really what makes it difficult for MedTech companies to ensure the same level of quality without applying a number of standards of quality assurance measurements and processes to, be able to state that we're doing an equivalent quality data collection as what we're doing, for example, in pharmaceuticals. And this is some of the reasons why a lot of people coming from pharma believe that it's just a piece of cake. But when it really comes down to it, it's actually more complex, because, like you're saying, simple things like intensive, like manuals to follow, can be the make or break a clinical study. So I want to guide or lead a discussion a little bit more towards trends happening in the industry. We have about 5 or 10 minutes left before we're going to open up for questions and answers. When we met last week, we talked a little bit about software as a medical device, and I guess there's a lot of people here that have something to do with software as a medical device in the professional life, whether it's a combination device of hardware and software, or software only. What trends are you seeing when it comes to clinical today with software-related medical devices, whether it's pure software as a medical device or medical devices with software component to them as well? Are there any specific new trends that you're seeing in terms of clinical data collection or clinical research in general?
Yeah, maybe I could take that and then have Matt follow me. Definitely, software as a medical device is its own beast, and that's sort of what I was referring to as the Wild West, is the technological enhancements and innovation that's happening. It's almost at the speed of light, where the regulators cannot necessarily pick up all the nuances to what clients are developing, what manufacturers are developing. I would say there's a couple of trends that I'm seeing. Those trends would be developing your intended use, indication for use, mechanism of action, and device description, which are the foundations to developing any device, from a product roadmap, from your quality management system, and really making sure that you're targeting those 4 things, is going in at the least, at the easiest route. So in other words, maybe if you can hang your hat on a 510K application, and then evolving the technology just to kind of get on the market first. So that's what I'm seeing, is almost like a lower bar. So Matt and I know that that intended use and indication for use, for instance, if you are an aid in the diagnosis, and that's AID, aid in the diagnosis of something, or to add to a toolkit of other clinical parameters, that is a much lower bar for market approval, much lower bar for clinical evidence generation, as opposed to cutting your teeth on a brand new state-of-the-art, brand new standard of care, where you're blowing everybody else out of the water and you become a definitive tool for diagnosis. Most of the software as medical device, because of the rapidness of the evolution, are kind of almost reverse engineering to a lower bar to get on the market first, get that approval, because let's face it, investors and folks who are investing in your company need to actually see you have a marketable device or diagnostic. So that's sort of a trend that I am seeing, is getting at a lower bar level on the market first, and then building out all those additional enhancements, because you do need to leverage. Investors need to see a return on their investment almost immediately, and that's an easy way to do it. A second trend I'm seeing is the deployment of artificial intelligence, machine learning, predicting apps that are being integrated directly into electronic medical records, EMR systems, for signal detection, or for safety detection, or to enhance the toolkits, basically. So I know that it's this amalgamation of the practice of medicine and the notion of clinical research, and it's coming. It's called federated medicine or federated learning. I bet a lot of folks who are participating on today's call are aware of this, and you know, there's no regulations out there except for these disparate kind of, here's some cybersecurity things we need to be aware of, here's how machine learning and artificial intelligence works. But all I can say is the FDA is very keen on these types of federated learning. So long as you're still validating that the use of and the deployment of that technology, the danger side to something like that is that your app, or that artificial intelligence machine learning component may behave differently in Epic or Allscripts or Cerner or these myriad of other electronic medical records. And so there does need to be some thinking behind that, but huge healthcare systems are now embracing this technology, and they're actually doing federated medicine now across the spectrum, where you're interpreting data, it's precision medicine, it is unique to an individual patient, and I think that's the frontier of medicine. I'd love to hear what Matt has to say.
Yeah, I'll echo those trends that you just said too. I agree completely. I mean, we've seen a lot of those same trends with looking for what's their fastest route to market, you know, looking for that aid versus the true diagnostic or true treatment or prognostic, which may take a little longer. And so essentially they're trying to create their own themselves as a quote unquote predicate, if you will, kind of in a sense. That's not really kind of the true regulatory way to describe it, but I think from a thought process, that's kind of what they're trying to do, essentially introduce their technology, which might be really novel as well, to the notifying bodies, agencies, have those discussions, and then find a way to get into the marketplace, get into the healthcare, get into use, get return on investment. So I absolutely echo that trend. I think we talked about it with review cycles and innovation, and that trend that we're seeing kind of pushes up against that. With software, I think what we've seen recently is it depends on kind of which review body you get, whether they've dealt with continuous measurements yet. Some groups have seen continuous measurements. Example, like a glucose monitoring system, right, for diabetics. That group has seen a lot of those types of devices for a while now, as opposed to other areas that we've seen being reviewed under other groups within the different agencies. They haven't seen quite those continuous measurements, and so they're learning how to tackle them, I think, and learning how to troubleshoot what's the clinical evidence volume. We've had that discussion recently this past like 6 months on, you know, what's the amount of data that's needed, right? They're getting continuous measurements. So the old way to measure blood pressure, as an example, is to measure it and you have a standing point, right? And you compare against that with a new product. Well, now you're getting measurements every millisecond, you know, or whatever it is. You're getting measurements at such a rapid pace. Do I really need 100 patients that I needed before? Because now I've got 1 billion measurements if I went up to that many patients.
Exactly.
So that type of push in the how you analyze the data, I think, is a trend that we're seeing.
That is a very interesting
volume
trend.
of data is so different than the volume of data before. One other trend I'd throw out there is just the way that our healthcare system has been collecting data for so many years now because of EMRs, healthcare record systems. There's just large amounts of data that for years, I think people didn't know what to do with that data. And now I think they're being creative. They're running studies with their products, especially these software products, against data sets that were prospectively collected, but now they're doing essentially a retrospective study on it. And so trying to have a discussion, again, what's the value of that data? What's the value of that clinical evidence? And how can I use that clinical evidence, right? I've run my AI product against this to not only train it, but now I have enough of that data where I can actually run it and validate it. You know, is that going to be enough of a data set for my product as well? So we're seeing that trend, I think, coming up a lot now with different data sets globally as well, not just in specific countries, but globally. I think there's a lot amount of data out there that you can run against and train your AI and train your algorithms, and then also potentially validate them again, depending on how that agency sees it.
It sounds to me like both of you mentioned parts of the same trend, which is where we're seeing clinical research becoming more and more tighter with traditional clinical practice. And much of it has to do with the fact that buyers are looking at the value of the products that they're buying to be something that needs to be continued to be proven, not only in closed loop environment like clinical investigation. So for example, we're seeing more trends in Europe here where buyers and procurement teams are requesting manufacturers to keep ongoing investigations or surveys or registries to be able to support that the value that we're getting out of this product is as documented, which can then help lead to higher discounts or larger, quotas of funds from governments and stuff like that, so that can be used to pay for the products. But we're almost out of time here when it comes to the panel and the conversation itself. And before we go ahead with the question and answers, I want to give you guys a chance to maybe leave the people that are attending here at the call with an advice or two. Is there anything particular we didn't touch upon today, Matt, that you just wanted to highlight for people that is worth noting from your side?
I think on my side, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead, Matt.
Oh, no, go ahead.
I think on my side, a takeaway is basically, as you're developing your product, the end goal is exactly what we're talking about, the utility, and potentially getting in front of medical societies to endorse your technology, or to begin that publication, that evidence generation, to have a compendium of evidence that is continuous over time. Because as we're talking about it, it is reducing the cost of care. If you're actually adding harm or not really adjusting cost of care, it's one of those things where it's not that valuable from an investment perspective. The software as a medical device and these in vitro diagnostics are easier plays for investments, as opposed to these more traditional class 3 onerous PMA-like devices that take forever to kind of get to market. So we're seeing, I bet, Matt, you're seeing a lot more of those types of easier to market plays.
What would you, Matt?
Yeah, I think the last, just to summarize, I think you had kind of said it, or three of us kind of mentioned it at the beginning. We were talking about the three components, whether it be clinical, but then also your regulatory and then your quality, making sure you're really keeping all those in sync. I mean, I think that's a key takeaway, that is a good reminder for all of those who are listening in or might listen to this. Keep all those things in sync, right? You need to really be aware of all the requirements that you're going to need for your product, and really keep them in step as you move through your clinical development plan, as you move through your product development plan. Keep all of those components in sync together, I think, is really just the key takeaway too. You can't be just focused on the engineering of your product, just focused on the regulatory pathway, or just focused on the clinical. You got to keep all those three things really in sync as you move through the path that you're taking your product through. I think that's kind of the key takeaway to me today.
Okay. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Alethea. Before we finish or wrap up the session today, I want to give the participants a chance to ask some of the questions. We already have 13 questions lined up here for us. So I can see that one of the most, one of them is related to the EU MDR requirements on sufficient clinical evidence, where they ask, what is your opinion on sufficient clinical evidence? What is sufficient? Can you explain this requirement on one product? So,
yeah, do you want me to take that?
Sure.
Yeah, real quickly, it's based on risk benefit. And when you can utilize and leverage literature, you can leverage your clinical evidence, whether these are small studies. Basically, the bottom line is proving out that you are safe and efficacious against your labeling claims. That's what it is.
Just to echo on that, there is a guideline that was published back in 2020 from the MDCG, the working group from the medical device area, the medical device working group from the European Commission. The MDCG 2026 guideline actually addresses this specifically. I just posted that here in the chat, the name and the the number of that particular guideline. So I would highly suggest that you review that as well. Thank you, Letha. Another question here. Is it true that the FDA requests at least 50, I guess it's 50% of the US population for clinical studies? So did the FDA request at least 50% of the EU population to be included in clinical studies?
Yeah, I'll jump in on that. I mean, it's not a hard and fast number. Obviously, you have to negotiate those numbers with the states. I will say the states does require some US population. Again, what that exactly is can be a negotiation on what other markets you're pulling that data in together from, and then how diverse, again, those populations are, where you're trying to actually either treat or diagnose, or what your product's actually doing. So I wouldn't say it's a hard and fast number. It's definitely a number that you should discuss with the agency, though. They want to know where your data is coming from, and what that data set is made up of. So discussing that early will help you evaluate what the exact number might be from the agency.
Thank you, Matt. They also follow up with, what about AI-based devices, and does this also apply for algorithm training and validation? I would say yes. I mean, we're just talking about different types of testing procedures and validation and data collection. So it all comes down to applying that same methodology on different populations.
Exactly.
Very good. So I saw another one here that I wanted to bring out. What should be considered for clinical validation of AI-based devices in general? How to prove clinical significance, for example. Do you have any thoughts on that? What should be considered for clinical validation of AI-based devices? I guess here they're referring to, how do you clinically validate that something that's built on artificial intelligence and machine learning is valid?
Just from my perspective, it's really making sure those training sets, you're locking your algorithms, and that you have ample data that proves out per the ISO standards for developing AI-based devices. There's a myriad of device standards that help guide you in both the sort of like that training set validation. You lock your design, and then you interrogate the data in trials, and you've got to prove out that diagnostic, or whatever you're calling the AI-based device, is proving out that exactly what they intended use, indication for use, mechanism of action, and device description is. It's those 4 basic principles that any regulator is going to need. So you've got to tease that out, both from a training set perspective and then the clinical significance.
Thank you, Letha. So another interesting question here, super simple, but very relevant, because it's not the first time I hear it. Number of clinical study sites. What is the minimum number of sites? Can you do 3, 2, or is 1 enough?
Yeah, it's always a question we get on a regular basis. I mean, there is no magic number necessarily of clinical sites. I mean, when you get into some very, very specific areas where the agency may want 2 sites for some reason, such as a CLIA waiver in the States. Again, that's a very specific instance, and outside of kind of normal pathway. But for the general, like, standard pathway, and there's not an exact number. You can run a study with 1 site. Again, they're going to look at the patient population, I think, is again key for your intended use, and how that population within that 1 site may apply more broader. So I'd be more concerned with just what is your patient population and your intended use, and then how is that representative of the overall population that you're trying to use in your product overall. Obviously, as we said earlier, you got to enroll your study too. So the least amount of sites that you can use is probably better, right, for you as from a cost standpoint. So you want to control that, but haven't seen any specific requirements on number of sites, except for, again, diversity of population, trying to meet the intended population.
Okay. Any thoughts on that, Alethea?
The same. I can't add anything.
Very good. Well, that actually wraps up the session. We're almost at the hour. So I'd like to close off for the questions for now, but I'd like to suggest that we collect the questions and then maybe get a round sent to you with some very short comments on these, and we'll try to share those with the attendees after the conference or the summit as well. But with that said, I'd like to thank you very much, Matt and Alethea, for attending the panel today. And the next session will be starting shortly. So stay tuned. You'll be hearing from more of our industry experts throughout the rest of the day. Thank you very much for joining us, and have a good rest of the summit.